Joining us on the telephone, gentlemen, I'm always happy to speak with Frederick Lawrence, who is CEO and Secretary, among other things, of the Phi Beta Kappa Society. He's also a distinguished lecturer in law at Georgetown University Law School. He's the past president of Brandeis University and a former dean at George Washington University School of Law. And I'm amazed that you have time to speak to us, sir. Hello, welcome.
How are you, Kris? It's always good to talk to you.
And I really liked, you appeared on Fox talking about Kavanaugh. I just appreciated your commentary there. So tell me about this, the Federal Commission, the Federal School Safety Commission, and this report.
Well, as you described it, it was in the aftermath of the tragedy at Parker School, and the assumption was that this would be a joint group involving people from the Department of Justice and the Education Department who would look into issues of school safety. And one of the first things one would hope that they would have focused on is the sheer, problem of guns and access to guns, which seems to be a huge problem here. To the extent that they're worried about safety in schools and giving schools the authority to protect themselves, that's not a bad thing. There's a positive room in that. The concern with stepping away from the Obama-era regulation is that the precise reason that regulation was put in place is there was reason to believe that, at least in some schools, school authorities were disproportionately punishing students of color.
Where did that reason to believe come from? It's not just like, gosh, that's what people say.
No. Look, well, they not only did study in that context, but you got to situate it in a broader context of differential punishment of people of color in the criminal justice system generally. So, this is one piece of a much broader problem. From my perch in the higher education space, this is particularly significant because you're getting kids at the point when this is your best chance to launch them into being productive members of society. And if the lesson that they learn early on is that they're being singled out on the basis of their race, you not only have not launched them in a positive way, you're actually reinforcing difficulties and negative attitudes and their reaction to stereotypes. So I think that was the context for that regulation, and it would be a shame to see that rescinded.
Well, and not only that, what the report says is that they're urging partnerships between schools, districts, states, and law enforcement for the training and arming of school personnel.
Well, the hope has to be that that's the piece that's for public relations consumption and not the actual regulations. The actual report itself does not formally advocate arming teachers, which was the soundbite that came out. So hopefully they're not going to move in that kind of a direction. Look, they're at the very far margins of this problem of school discipline within the school. There is a law enforcement issue. There is such a thing as violence in a school of student to student that could involve law enforcement. But that's way out on the margin. The vast majority of cases that are happening in a school is well within the domain of school authorities to work with, because at the end of the day, you got to remember these kids are there to learn, and some of these situations are complicated, some of these situations are obviously fraught, but at the end of the day, these are not penal institutions, these are educational institutions. And so even in a disciplinary matter, our goal is to educate, not to punish. So to start with the assumption that we're going to punish is really looking at this through the wrong end of the tube.
Frederick Lawrence, longtime educator at the higher education levels, college and graduate school. So I was interested in the responses by former education secretaries, including Arne Duncan, but John King Jr. as well, and they criticized this report mightily, especially this point that we're looking at about rescinding the school discipline policies. And I asked you about what basis there was for the decision in the first place to institute this policy, because the White House officials say that the commission had heard a, quote, recurring narrative, unquote. That's what they were using to base their decision on, that teachers and students were afraid because individuals who had a history of antisocial and sometimes violent behavior were left unpunished or unchecked. Where are the stats? Where are the studies? Where's the facts, the science?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that the fact underpinning it was very thin, particularly when you consider that a couple of years back, the facts underpinning the concern of disproportionate punishment for certain students was quite strong and quite serious. By the way, switching gears from the educational side to the law side, as a matter of administrative law, you can't, as an administration, just change a regulation. You've got to have a factual basis for doing that. So I would imagine if this report actually turns into policy, I suspect it's going to find its way into the courts and be challenged on that basis, where the administration is going to have to support it with facts. And some judge is going to say exactly what you just said. Where are the facts?
I'm thinking about I had a conversation yesterday with John Nichols of The Nation magazine about the pressure that this White House and this president are under currently, and the desperate attempts. Like today, he's announcing, we finished, we killed him, ISIS is dead, we're all pulling out. It's like, what? No one but him wants and the troops themselves and the troops' families, of course, want them pulled out. But everything to appeal to his base, and this could be another one of those instances. I'm not sure where will this. What will happen? Can they rescind it like that? Just say off with her head?
No, you can't just rescind it like that, or you can try to, but as I say, then that gets tangled up in the courts. Look, the perfect example, staying within the education space, the perfect example was the regulation from the Obama administration under which students who owed debt back on their borrowing to go to school, if the school collapsed, went bankrupt or closed its doors, those students would get those debts canceled. That's what the Obama-era regulation said. The current administration resisted that mightily and were challenged in court, and a federal judge required them to abide by that regulation. So, in fact, right now, as you and I are talking right now, there are letters that are going out to something on the order of 15,000 young people telling them that their debts have been canceled because the schools to which they were attended or were attending went out of business. Now, the administration is going to take credit for that and call it a Christmas present to those students, and I suppose good news is always welcome. But the fact is they got brought into this kicking and screaming. And so,
yes, Betsy DeVos tried to stop that whole thing, delay the regulation.
She did try to delay it, but it actually got put into effect because a federal judge required, saying you can't fail to enforce it.
Yeah,
now,
he said she was doing something unlawful, basically.
That's right. That's right. Well, look, these regulations are there for a reason, and they don't just come and go. It's a very detailed process, and it's designed to create a sticking quality such that you need reasons to change it. And the reasons can't just be that today is Wednesday and yesterday was Tuesday. There's got to be some basis for it.
Well, in the industry, the for-profit education, quote-unquote, industry was part of the resistance as well. And they had tried to get this rule postponed. This is well, of course, that brings me to charter schools and all that stuff. I wonder what comments you might have on the commercialization of education.
Well, I think once we start down that road, often, I'm not going to say always, but often bad things happen. At the end of the day, the two most important things to think about in terms of education, and they fit together. One is that we're about educating our young people. That's the goal here. And the other is that education is a public good. It's not a private good. Let's do 2 minutes of American history on this. One of the great social experiments in American history is the GI Bill following the Second World War. GIs returned from Europe. Many of them barely made it out of high school. They're supported to go to college, and what follows is an economic and social explosion in this country of talent unleashed such as we've never seen before. So we know what happens when we take our best people and give them an opportunity to be educated in a broad fashion. It doesn't just benefit them, it benefits the entire society. All right, so I say this because that's what private and public not-for-profit schools produce. When you're in the for-profit context, then your goal is not the public good of education, it's returning value to your shareholder. That is always going to create disincentives to really focus on the two most important things, educating our students and producing the public good of education.
Now, along with that relief of debt, which is a good thing, even though it had to be challenged in court to do it. And you, it says you have said, you've been talking about this before, over 40% of student debt goes to graduate and professional level students.
That's right.
Rather than And what they want to do is reduce oversight for all these schools, like Trump University.
Well, we have a model for that, and it wasn't a very good one. I mean, the fact is we know that in the area of education, there's a reason for this regulation because you've got consumers, if you want to call the students consumers of education, and they're trying to make the best decision they can, but they're making a very expensive decision. It's worth those resources, but it's a very expensive one, and this is a role the government can play to help both provide those funds and also to protect them. And just to come back to the point I made earlier, not just because it's nice to those young people, although this is true too, because ultimately it's what makes for the best, most productive, and most generous self-governing society.
You're listening to Frederick Lawrence, who is Distinguished Lecturer in Law at Georgetown University School of Law, past President of Brandeis University, former Dean at George Washington University School of Law, and CEO and Secretary of the Phi Beta Kappa Society. I mentioned earlier that I had appreciated, he appears on many's the outlets, and one of them was Fox, and I saw this on his own website as opposed to on Fox. No, don't want to hint that I ever watched Fox to KPFA audience, but at any rate, you were being interviewed about Judge Kavanaugh and the impact of these charges against him prior to the debate that occurred, where the woman presented her side. Was he said, she said. It hadn't happened yet. You were prognosticating about what it would mean, and you said at the time that this is so detrimental. Any question of the integrity of the proposed judge would be so detrimental to the reputation and the role of the judiciary. And I wonder what you think now in retrospect that Mr. Kavanaugh was in fact confirmed.
Well, I have the same concern. The legitimacy of the court is a absolutely crucial part of our entire system of government, and legitimacy requires people to trust in the integrity of the court and to trust in the integrity of the system, because almost it's a given that over time courts will make decisions that you will like and decisions I will like and ones you won't like and ones that I won't like, and that's part of being part of a democracy. It only works if people trust that the system is actually one that's based on integrity. So now we're on the other side of the process. Brett Kavanaugh is Justice Kavanaugh. He's on the Supreme Court. He's got life tenure under Article 3 of the Constitution. I think now it becomes terribly important for the court itself to protect its own integrity and legitimacy. My prediction is that Chief Justice Roberts, who cares deeply about the legitimacy of the court, will do his best to have a very calm term or two. I suspect you're going to see dockets that are not going to have a lot of sort of, red light kind of cases. They'll be the kind of cases that lawyers will focus on, but not the kind that the whole population focuses on. And he will try his hardest not to have any of these 5-4 decisions in very, very dramatic cases. Now, he can't keep that off forever, but we need a couple of years where this whole thing sort of settles down and tamps down a little bit, because right now it's still pretty hot to the touch.
Well, the ACA ruling could greet the Supreme Court right soon.
Well, that's it. That I've been thinking of that as soon as I saw that decision. As a matter of fact, the first thing I saw that, and I said to my wife, John Roberts is having a bad moment right now. But in reality, what will happen, Kris, is that case will wend its way through the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit.
Which has been described as a conservative circuit.
It has been described as a conservative circuit, but it's not clear that this is a decision that is best understood as a conservative or a liberal decision. Don't forget, the ACA was upheld by this Supreme Court. In fact, Chief Justice Roberts twice was in the majority upholding the ACA. So there are ways in which the Fifth Circuit could uphold it, and remember that the Supreme Court does not have to take an appeal from the Court of Appeals. So if the ACA is upheld by the Court of Appeals, then even if the states who are challenging it seek to go to the Supreme Court could simply deny review. They don't have to take the case. And in fact, and I don't want to get too technical with you, but there's one way in which the case could pretty easily be resolved. A lot of the whole holding was on one particular provision, the requirement that the individual mandate, which no longer holds up given the fact that the tax penalty has been struck down, taken away by Congress. The question, though, is even if that's removed, should the rest of the statute stand? It's what's called severability. Can you sever this from the rest of the statute and have it stand? This judge said, no, you take this piece out and the whole statute has to fall. The Court of Appeals could say, that piece should be out, but the rest of the statute could stand. That's a very small decision in terms of great constitutional decisions. The Court of Appeals could choose to do that, make the smallest decision you can, as Louis Brandeis always said. Courts should make the smallest decision they can and assume the constitutionality of a statute, and then the Supreme Court wouldn't have to be involved. So I'm going to make a prediction to you right now that this particular case is never going to find its way to the Supreme Court. Now, maybe I'll be wrong, so we'll have a chance to talk about it, but that's my prediction.
Frederick Lawrence, sir, I thank you so much for spending some of your day with us. I always learn something when you do. Frederick Lawrence, a distinguished lecturer in law at Georgetown University School of Law, etc., etc., etc. Thank you, sir.
Pleasure. Nice being with you, Kris. Take care.
Indeed.